it's such a pleasure to be here and to be invited to this quite significant move here in the old city of Toronto. And I want to congratulate everybody who's organized this institute and gotten it rolling. It's not a biography, but when I became interested in Islam in about 1973 or 4, I studied with Hannah Kassis at the University of British Columbia, who, when he spoke about the Quran, the air would change color. It was unrepeated experience in my education. And I was going to be a lawyer. And after I took Kassis's course, it was all over. And he Palestinian Christian who adored the Quran. And, but in those days, you know, Shi'ism, if it was ever mentioned, was mentioned in the context of being the wrong version of Islam by people who had no idea what they were talking about. You know, this is the heresy, and Sunni Islam is the orthodoxy. Look what's happened. In 45 years or so, it's completely changed, even if everything isn't where we would like to see it now. But this is wonderful, and we're all very grateful to the hard work that's going on here to make this institute a thriving, productive, attractive place. And this is a wonderful step in that direction, because it's an honor to be here with so many wonderful speakers, renowned speakers, people who have changed the field. I don't want to mention any names because I have to mention everybody. So I'm very, very proud to be part of this operation and this event. Islam from the beginning in the Hejaz and the historical nexus into which it came and into which it was born. It was conceived in the Hejaz and it was born in Mesopotamia. Let's look at it this way, all right? It was born in a context and in the midst of a kind of language and talking about religion and human experience that put on the table the quest for what we now call, centuries after the fact, the search for a unified field theory about everything. About everything. It's in the Quran, it's in the life of the Prophet, upon whom be blessing and peace. It is haunting all of the works of especially the philosophers. But not only, because all Muslims in some way or another have this DNA which urges toward this notion of a unified notion of existence, life, and being alive on the planet. What I want to say is, because the time is naturally limited, and there's a great deal to say, and you know, I've been trying to figure out how to say everything. It's not going to be possible, unfortunately, but I'm going to say a few things. But before I sit down, I want to make sure that I get across the point that I want us to think about, that Ibn Arabi, who died in the middle of the 13th century, had an enormous impact. I agree with what Sajjad says. I think Ibn Arabi is probably one of the 5 most influential Muslims who ever drew a breath. And I like the idea of the most important thinker, philosopher, visionary, perceiver, writer, however we want to distinguish it, because that's one of the problems with Ibn Arabi, is how to categorize it, and thank God, because we have enough of the categories. Enough, right? They are more trouble than they are worth. What Corban calls the rut of universals. Let's get out of the rut of universals, right? Let's go for the particular. Ibn Arabi was all about the particular. And what he bequeathed to the world in general, and especially to Shi'ism at a particular time, which I'll talk about more specifically in a second, what he bequeathed was what we would now call today a scientific language, even though he's called a Sufi and a mystic and a Gnostic and all of these things that seem to be at the other end of human mental activity from what we think of as science. Ibn Arabi was a scientist. Avant la lettre. The word science didn't even start being used in English until the late 18th century, in the 19th century. We didn't have it in English. How much less in Islam, where we're interested in ilm, right? And ilm is one thing, nuqtatun wahid wa akthara al-jahilun, right? So this is what Ibn Arabi is about, and the specific scientific terminology that he bequeathed to all the Islamic world and anybody who read him centers around the idea of the permanent archetypes, the ayan, his notion of the circulation of divine energy in the cosmos, sarayan, right? And his idea of perfect man, and his notion of revelation, which is based on this insight in the Fusus, where he says in many different ways, but that the truth, God, the absolute truth, describes himself to us, through us. To us, through. It's not just to us, right? وصفناه نفسه لنا, right? بنفسنا. So this is a very organic and unified field theory type of apperception. This is what gave hope to the Muslim world in the aftermath of the Mongol devastations, because it placed the reality, the most real thing in the universe, the spiritual realm, in an unassailable fortress of the soul. Okay, so this is what I want to make sure gets across, because I think this it's not excessively confessionally Shi'i, these ideas, but because of the particular time of the Safavid moment or beginning of the Safavid period in which Shi'ism was consolidated in its more or less current form, and which changed Shi'ism. This kind of certitude, because the certitude comes through not only through the scientific terminology, these technical terms that are extremely important for Ibn Arabi and for his readership, but also for the majestic confidence that he had about what he said and about what his experience was. And another thing, about the way in which he marshaled the Quran in his explanations of things. This was dizzyingly fascinating, enthralling, and overwhelming, because it was if that, I've used this in other contexts. For Ibn Arabi, it's as if the Quran was a piano with 6,000 keys, and he sat down and played it effortlessly and made the combinations that came out of his nafs speak to the world in an aesthetic. We were speaking about aesthetics, in an aesthetic and visionary rhetoric that was irresistible to the people who were on board. So now I shall read. Thank you for listening to me try to explain what I'm trying to do. There are a number of ways to begin a lecture that has a title like this, Enchanted Cosmos. I wanted to add it because he's also given us an enchanting cosmos. It's not only enchanted. But it's best here to choose the most straightforward, if slightly fraught, starting point, namely historical time, of the type we see unfolding around us now. Ibn Arabi and his works ultimately became an important resource for the reconstitution or renaissance not only of Imami Shi'ism that began in earnest with the Safavid conquest of the Iranian highlands at the beginning of the 16th century, but also Sunni Islam, wherever it happened to be found. His prominence in the thought world of scholars, such as Mir Damad and Mullah Sadra, may be considered the result of a development that had begun several centuries earlier, probably before he died. Abdul Rahman Jami, a Sunni author, is perhaps one of the most important channels through which Ibn Arabi came to Persianate culture. There are others, obviously. But there is much activity before his work. He died in 1492. Especially amongst explicitly Shi'i scholars. Certainly, interest in Ibn Arabi and Shi'ism had achieved irreversible prominence in the writings of some early Bahrani scholars, beginning probably with Ibn Sa'ada, then certainly with Ibn Abi Sulaiman, who died in 1271, and most assuredly with Maytham al-Bahrani, who died in 1282. This was discovered by Arabi many, many years ago, and he wrote about it, but it hasn't really made that much of a splash in scholarship, and it needs to be looked at and read more of. I excuse myself for not doing this. So the rest of you should do this, of course. And of course, the writings of Ibn Arabi were not only of interest to Shi'i scholars. Before returning to the pre-Safavid history of Shi'i scholarship on Ibn Arabi, it is important to set the scene. From the time of the Mongol occupation, which saw the first destruction of Baghdad in 1258 until today, the vision of Ibn Arabi has captured the imagination of a large and influential segment of the greater Muslim and Islamicate community. It has functioned here as something of a tool of conviviality for bridging distances that might otherwise divide amongst Muslims of various communal identities, and provided a table around which a wide variety of temperaments, styles of piety, and political agendas have met. Before proceeding to specify specific cases in our concentration here on Shi'i Islam, it may be helpful to offer a brief analysis of why this occurred. There really is no doubt that Ibn Arabi is one of the 5 or so most influential Muslims who have ever lived. His influence has blossomed in a number of different ways, which there is no time to enumerate, even if we could. His influence was transmitted to some extent on the wave of a scandal involving the controversy frequently associated with his name, beginning during his lifetime, a controversy that centered on, for lack of a better phrase at the moment, the oneness and transcendence of God, 2 non-negotiable Quranic principles. Some of this controversy was no doubt sincere. Some of it was no doubt semantic, as in the case of Simnani. Some of it was doubtless mischievous or playful. Some of it was no doubt fomented for political reasons. And some of it was what the result of Jami observed most eloquently, plain stupidity. They didn't understand him. But whatever the cause and context, the controversy burgeoned and redounded to the fame of Ibn Arabi and his writings. It seems there really is no such thing as bad publicity. What it has become convenient to refer to as his 2 most important works, the Fusus and the Futuhat, were widely copied, another word for published, and spawned numerous commentaries. As his fame or notoriety spread, so did his readership, and partly attracted by the aura of forbiddenness, but I think the main reason is elsewhere. He wasn't only forbidden fruit. It wasn't only a scandal. This readership had recently been subject to the unpredictable and unimaginable chaos with the above-mentioned Mongol invasions. This occupation was incalculably destructive of life, property, and in some ways, most importantly, the shared security and indeed euphoria that Islam was the perfect and therefore permanent last religion. I'm talking about the destruction of a self-image of an entire civilization. This is some serious historical fact, irrefutable. With the fall of Baghdad in 1258, such euphoria was drained away, and with it arose numerous existential questions that the Ummah as a whole had not ever had to face on such a wide scale, such as, what did we do wrong? Is God punishing us by sending the Mongols to us? What is the meaning of justice? Has the hour actually struck? Is it really now the end of the world? This sent the entire community reeling. It would revive. But this was, and it's not a coincidence in the context of our study of Ibn Arabi that he died 18 years before the destruction of Baghdad. And his works were already in Bahrain and elsewhere acquiring a certain amount of enthusiasm for his unified field theory. The kingdom was being limbed and drawn and made clear and irrefutable in a region that was far beyond the ability of anyone to destroy. This is what Ibn Arabi is doing. Islam, which of course means submission and commitment to the cause of God, is also in some ways a synonym for civilization and an antonym for its opposite, barbarism or savagery, represented by the excellent Arabic word jahl. How can it be that these uncivilized savages from beyond the wall of Alexander have been allowed to swoop down and destroy what was perhaps the most socially, scientifically, economically advanced society on the planet? And of course, the destruction was immense. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had been a symbol of the unity, truth, and triumph of Islam for centuries. Even if not every Muslim of the time would approve of its record, its activities, its plans, and administrative culture. It was gone, like that fish of Moses, right? Its destruction, apparently achieved without much opposition, was breathtaking to observers and pierced the confidence and hope of the Muslim population. Perhaps on a par with the passing of the Prophet, although that was natural by comparison, or the fracturing of the Muslim community during the first fitna, or the ensuing fitnas that Hodgson records. Not even these events can capture the dramatic horror and the existential crisis that ensued with the Mongol invasions. Towers of skulls were built from the inhabitants of towns outside the gates of the cities, which were supposed to be refuges of civilization. And it goes on and on. When the Prophet died, Islam as a social and cultural reality had in fact just been conceived. Its actual birth would occur elsewhere, namely in Mesopotamia, whose capital was Baghdad. Moreover, Islam had been extant and mighty for 6 solid centuries, with unchallenged triumph and relative prosperity, even if there were a more or less constant succession of sometimes quite divisive and vociferous conflicts and debates within the Muslim community. None of this, however, tarnished or took away from the symbolic luster of Baghdad, the city of peace. The beginning of the Safavid phase of Iranian history, in some sense, a reincarnation, or perhaps better, hologram or homologation of the idea of Baghdad, in the early 16th century, marks the beginning of a new epoch in Imami Shi'ism. It is the first time since the Fatimids that Shi'ism had become the ruling religion of a large polity over a vast geographic territory. Of the many factors involved in this new beginning, whether social, historical, economic, or purely intellectual, one has to do with the way in which the work of Ibn Arabi was taken to the heart of much of Safavid Shi'i theological and philosophical research right from the very beginning. As a purely intellectual is mentioned with inverted commas around the word purely. It is a truism that the work of the mind, whether we locate the mind in the head or in the breast, or somewhere between the two, is also formed by those other more dunyawi factors such as weather, economics, political history, diet, geography, and so on. And of course, we know that the work of the mind can have irreversible effects on those dunyawi factors. This mutuality between the visible and the invisible is, of course, something that we read both between the lines and in the very lines of Ibn Arabi's teachings. God describes himself to us through us. To us through us. Although it's beyond dispute that the divine essence for Ibn Arabi remains unknowable and beyond contact, utterly transcendent, the rays of the divine in the form of names, attributes, and signs ceaselessly bring information, knowledge, wisdom to human beings. Thus, when God describes himself, he is describing the world and vice versa. This is one of the insights that has a very powerful insight from the experience of Ibn Arabi. To return to the topic of the Shi'i reception of Ibn Arabi, or better, the domestication of Ibn Arabi's dangerous ideas for Shi'i consumption, a few well-known names need to be mentioned very quickly. These are scholars who, in some cases, their quite considerable output is distinguished from other Shi'i scholars by the way in which Ibn Arabi's ideas are read, critiqued, commented upon, and eventually digested as part of the guiding spiritual ethos of a philosophical Shi'ism whose influence has been and remains remarkably strong. In addition to the three names of those earlier Bahrani scholars, there are the usual people that we all know, but I'll just mention them just so we have an idea. And there are many more than these names. Kashani, whose Shi'ism and Sunnism is always a topic of conversation. Haydar Amali, Raja Bursi, Sainuddin ibn Turk Esfahani, Ibn Abi Jumhur, Mir Damad, Mullah Sadra, Muhammad Taqi Majlisi, Muslim Faiz, Ala Zikrihi Salam, Qutbuddin Ashgavari, Qazi Said Qumi, even Muhammad Baqir Majlisi, who has, say there was influence doesn't mean that the person agrees with everything, but the contact with Ibn Arabi stimulates the soul, no matter which way it goes. There's a problem of taste somewhere. Somebody was speaking about it. Yes. Sheikh Ahmad Asai, who also is a member of the club of calling Ibn Arabi Mumituddin. Yeah. But read his works and you see that the electricity is there. There is no doubt about it. So it's like Fakhruddin Razi in arguing against, becomes an expert in Ash'ari Kalam. Not that he agrees with everything that goes on, but it's what happens in the life of the mind. And then finally, Mullah Hadis Sabzavari. Chronologically, we must mention Henry Corbin here, and Allama Tabatabai, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and Sayyid Jalaluddin Ashtiani. This is quite a club dear friends. Devout Shi'i, I mean, we don't know what Corban's ultimate position is, but he did as much as anybody to bring together these streams and to explain how it happened. And if we want to know more, we need to translate An Islam Iranian so the world can read this book, since they're not going to bother unless it's in English. You see? The holy language of the time, right? It should be added by way of reminding us of the universal appeal Ibn Arabi had for Muslim intellectuals in the long period from the mid-13th to the early 16th century, that many non-Shi'i authors, or authors whose allegiance in such matters was not crystal clear, and most importantly, those who wrote in Persian, paid serious attention to Ibn Arabi, like Shabastari, like Simnani, like Jami and Davani. These people were, Ibn Arabi was, there was a great deal of, of collective hope in this creation, the artistry, the deep knowledge, the confidence, the tirelessness, the universal mind of Ibn Arabi. And the hope is that it helped to replace the Dar al-Mithaq, the abode of the covenant, and establish it firmly in the world of the spirit, what Corban calls the Alam al-Mithal, Hurkaliya, the kingdom of God, the fortress of the soul. There it cannot ever be destroyed. And Ibn Arabi, through his reading of the Quran, the way in which he miraculously brings the Quran to bear on everything in the universe, his distinctive terminology, his vision, helped to establish this. But it's also resident in his Arabness, especially for Iran, because this Arabness has great prestige amongst Persian scholars of Islamic thought and literature and law. And again, the center place that Ibn Arabi gives to the Quran in all of his writings. You can't read a page of Ibn Arabi without there being, it helps, frankly, it helps to know that there's the Quran, and you can sometimes, if you can't get a handle on it any other way, well, you can look at the Quran and try and imagine what he's saying about it. And but this is a pedagogy as well that he's adopted, this Quranic pedagogy that he uses to deploy and spread and teach and deepen the world in his particular, very Aini experience, which is also miraculously somehow universal. And that, of course, applies to people who are Sunni or Shi'i or non-aligned, who Jami claimed, and of course he was a Sunni Muslim, claimed to be non-aligned in numerous places. I'm not a Sunni dog, I'm not a Shi'i donkey. He says this. Yeah, in his Jami al-Asrar. He said, I refuse to be categorized. And where does this fear and loathing of categorization come from, dear friends? Where do you think? Right? It's from the metaphorical, powerful Sarayani language of Ibn Arabi, who causes everything to shift while you're reading it. The subject becomes the verb, and the verb becomes the subject. The zahir becomes the batin, and the batin becomes the zahir. You think you're smart? People, read this. You know? You think the earth is staying still? Read this. Haraka bara. Right? So, I see this as applying first and foremost to my favorite verse in the Quran, the Day of the Covenant, the Day of Al-Last. We need to have a department on the Day of Al-Last at the university. This is what we need, all right? So remember, the Quran is addressing Muhammad. Remember, Muhammad, it doesn't say this, but this is the idea. وَإِذْ Remember, O Muhammad, when your Lord took from the loins of the children of Abraham their seeds, their particularity, and caused them to bear witness about themselves, and asked them the question, am I not your Lord? And their reply, immediate reply, doesn't have to say it because it's carried in the reply, Bala, means immediate, unhesitating, polite, that negates any possibility of negativity, Bala. Yea, verily, absolutely. Indeed, we bear witness. And then the Quran, being helpful, sympathetic, says, this was said so that at the time of Qiyamah, you would not be able to claim that you didn't know anything about your responsibility to God. It doesn't say that explicitly, but this is the gist of the Quran. So this is, as everyone knows, this Day of the Covenant. In the tafsir literature, there are a number of ways of looking at it, but the one that has emerged as being the single most powerful image is that this occurred at a time before creation. Before creation, God, in the persona of your Lord, it's not Allah, remember, it's Rabbakum, addressed the potential of every future human being that would ever be created. This is a different kind of science. They were all there on this plane of the spiritual realm when this question was asked. Everyone who would ever live, including everyone that you might be thinking of at this moment. Good, bad, ugly, beautiful, every human soul that was given this question and responded in a time before creation. Ibn Arabi gives us a way of believing this with the Ayn al-Yaqeen, that it's not just a story. It's not just an entertainment that you tell to your kids to scare them into behaving themselves, although it does work that way too. It is, if you like, a physical reality. It is a reality, and it is, in the context of Ibn Arabi's thought, more real than anything else. Or maybe slightly less exaggerated. I don't want to be a Ghali. Nothing else is more real than this. Okay? So, the covenant, the Day of the Covenant, is for the Quran the beginning of time, being, and history, and everything else. In the same way that Genesis is the beginning for the Hebrew Bible. And it comes in the middle of the Quran. It doesn't come at the beginning, but it's still the beginning. It's the beginning of the Quranic epic. It is also the beginning of consciousness, most importantly. Having been born on the Day of the Covenant, every time consciousness is deployed, it represents, in a sense, remembrance of the Day of the Covenant. Every time. You cannot be conscious and not be automatically involved in the Day of the Covenant. It doesn't matter if you know it or not. That's immaterial. Eventually you'll get to understand this. But this is the way the universe works. So every thought is a remembrance, an imitation, a reenactment, or performance. One of Corban's great words, hikaya. And if we have time, we'll go there too, but it looks like we're not going to have time. However non-existent it may be. Thus the Quran, in Mushafi form, begins in the middle of things. Ultimately, of course, the Quran is not fully at ease with these traditional categories, beginning, middle, and end. It unfurls its particular character in serene disdain for such relative banalities. The totem symbol, identified by Norman Brown in his marvelous article, The Apocalypse of Islam, which he says that and he wasn't an Islamic scholar or Arabic scholar or anything, he was a reader, said that the Quran is unique because it really doesn't matter where you open the book. It is all there all the time, whatever you begin to read or wherever you end. Every word implies every other word. This is a genius apperception about the way the Quran lives in the hearts of human beings, and I think the way it describes itself. But narrative, in the standard understanding of the term, is also extremely important for the Quran, and the Quran's epic function. Whether we take as our historical beginning the story of Adam and Eve, first encountered in Surah 2, or the day of Alast, the opening of the book assumes we are on a path. We're on a path from that event headed for home, headed for Qiyamah, headed for the divine presence, headed for the place we began, which is the day of Alast. It is a circle. The straight path is a circle. Right? All of us, the prophet hero, humanity, the individual human being, are precisely and firmly in medias res, on the road, fi sabil. So after an invocation of the Quranic muse, that is God, if you will, and after beholding ourselves on a path, we discover we are in the midst of the action. It is normally the hero who is thus situated, but the Quran, in some sense, wants to implicate everyone in the heroic quest and the heroic struggle. It is important to observe that that path or road, by whatever word it may be designated, is one of the more frequent and defining metaphors in the Quran. Consider how many words there are for path or road in the Quran and in the extra Quranic literature. Right? It is a permanent feature. We are in motion. We are transforming ourselves, even if not existentially, from one place to another. The place may also be spiritual. So its movement is key. And this is why Sarayan is such an important aspect of Ibn Arabi's da'wah, if you like. So what are some of the features of the covenant? It is explicitly described as part of the divine revelation. It is the word of God. So this gives it immediate, unanswerable, non-negotiable authority. It's there. It's told in the Quran. So it's not a mere entertainment, whatever else it may be. Yes, the Quran is literature, but as Northrop Frye said about the Bible, it's also more than literature, right? Because it precisely of the da'wah, the charigma, the summons of human beings. All humanity that would ever be and ever was, no matter if we thought we wouldn't ever want to be in the same room with them, were there. We were all together at that place and time. This is a permanent image of the Quran. All humanity, collectively and individually, this isn't not frequently mentioned, but here we are, directly addressed by God. All humanity is directly addressed by God in this scene in the Quran. So everyone participates to some extent or another in the prophetic vocation. Every human being. This is part of their aim. The ayan are Ibn Arabi's translation of the word dhurriyatuhum. This is where Ibn Arabi, in a genius move, applies his theurgic science to the narrative of the Quran and creates a new world. The immutable, permanent archetypes that are there on the day of Alast, called Dhar in the Quran, Dhuriyat, are at the moment this Bala is uttered, he says in Futuhat, are filled to overflowing with light. Filled to overflow. This is a scientific vision, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. This is an understanding that has serious persuasive power for this audience at this time and this place. All humanity, but this is perhaps even more difficult to believe, all humanity gathered in the divine presence are gathered there in peace and love and harmony. Can you imagine an audience in Mecca at the time of the revelation of this verse, listening to this and imagining Jews and Sabians and Persians and Greeks and everybody in the same place and not murdering each other? And this may in fact be the point of this vision of the Day of the Covenant, because it implants in the soul and the heart of the child of the Quran this hope for absolute peace, human harmony, conviviality, living together as part of the revelation, not as something extra. Here all humanity also participate and are conditioned by divine apophaticism. God is ever unknowable completely, and by virtue of their being addressed by God, they share in this apophaticism. So that God's potential is one thing. We have no way of approaching this problem. But if we look at divine potential as being reflected and brought down to earth in the notion of human potential, which is the other side of human, the apophatic nature of humans, then it gives us also scope, vision, and hope that human beings can grow, can develop, can attain. It looks as if, I'll just read a couple of it because it goes on and on. I'm sorry. Sheikh Ahmad Asai, who, as we said, refers to Ibn Arabi as Mumit ad-Din, but who was nonetheless heavily schooled by his vision, and also argued that he got it from the Imams, by the way, Sheikh Ahmad Asai, asked this question: can you imagine someone so misguided and so dim that they actually think that the covenant was a one-time event? What he means is, for example, you see, in the classical Islamic topic of Khalq Jadid, which the theologians, the Sunni theologians, constructed this notion of saving God from the notion of secondary causality, established the system whereby at every atom of time, the world is created and destroyed. It's magnificent as far as it goes. What we don't talk about here, when we learn this at the table at McGill in 1976 or whenever it was, what we don't think about then is what's between those two moments, the destruction and the creation. Well, I think you know now what's between those two moments. The permanence of the Day of the Covenant. This is what allows that construct to have legs, to work. Because if it weren't there, it would not fly. they felt perhaps it was insulting the intelligence of their audience by mentioning this explicitly, but or whatever. But that is what causes this beautiful theory to be so successful. Corban pointed out in his very first work in Islamic studies called Toward a Philosophical Anthropology, or Anthropology of Philosophy, a study of the Munis al-Ushaq of Sohrawardi. He says there that Sohrawardi's tales of initiation all derive their energy from the day of the last. That if we hadn't had this scenario in the Quran, Sohrawardi would have ended up, he doesn't say this explicitly, I'm extrapolating, forgive me, but this is the key. And this is also the object of Corban's favorite word, this idea of recital, hikayah, which is simultaneous narrative and imitation. And so our job is to, at every moment, as Sheikh Ahmad was, because Sheikh Ahmad was a big fan of meditating on these things, even if he thought he disagreed with Ibn Arabi. Our job is to consider this scenario individually at every moment and to experience it in this haki anho method. Not just to tell the story to yourself, oh, isn't that interesting, and I wonder how that could be, blah, 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 but to penetrate into the truth, the symbolic truth of the Day of the Covenant. And Ibn Arabi bequeathed this to Safavid Iranian Ibn Arabi scholars. Thank you.
Okay, I think we do have a bit of time.
Yeah, we do.
For some discussion. So I'm opening the floor to any comments, any questions.
And better bottle of water.
Oh yes. Anyone who want to kick? Yes, please.
Sorry, I just have a very general question in regards to something in the abstract, talking about the problem with the word mysticism.
Oh, yes.
So I was wondering, in relation to the word mysticism or gnosis, how can, why is it problematic, or how can we best translate things like Irfan, Sufism, and Tasawwuf?
Right. Well, that's not a problem so much, but the problem is in English, there are a number of ways of understanding the word mysticism. Irfan is beautiful because Irfan plays right into this theory of the covenant, because the idea is not only to participate as a haki and in the reliving of that as a spiritual exercise and mode of acquiring knowledge, wisdom, intensity. I have to read one more paragraph before I leave. But we're also supposed to recognize everybody else, that we were there with people. This is the plan. To know that we have to reinstitute that eternal peace that was spoken of on the Day of the Covenant. So this of course is a Gnosticism. This is the main conduit, I think, for Gnosticism of the late antique period into the Quranic Weltanschauung. This and other similar things in the Quran. The idea of the stranger coming to earth, being moved out into so-called reality in order to find our way back. The Day of the Covenant is really the center of it. But in English, there are many different ways of thinking about mysticism. One of the most interesting things in teaching a course on introductory Islam many years ago across the street here in Toronto, we were looking at Ibn Arabi. I don't know if you're here today. I don't remember the name, unfortunately. But I asked everyone, what is this work? How would you classify this? Is it philosophy? Is it theology? Is it is it Quran commentary? And this brilliant fellow said, it's a way of seeing. I've loved that ever since. It's a way of seeing. That's what Ibn Arabi bequeaths to us. And we don't have to worry so much about all of these blinking categories. I don't know if I answered your question, but thank you for posing it.
Any other questions, comments?
Oh, good, then I can read my book.
Can I
Yeah, please, the far line.
yeah, so one of the terms, of course, that you used in the title, which I'd like you to speak a bit more about, is walaya.
I thought so.
So where does walaya fit in all this?
Well, walaya is a favorite topic of Ibn Arabi, as we all know. It's there throughout his work. But even before we get to walaya in Ibn Arabi, the word is a miracle of language, of linguistic simultaneous precision and confusion. Because, the way it sounds, the way it lives in the heart, the way it's like, revelation is water. Walaya sounds like water. Walaya. It's a very liquid idea. It means love, it means allegiance, it means loyalty, it means intimacy, it means friendship, it means all of these things. Ibn Arabi knew this more than all of us together. So it was a central concept. For Ibn Arabi, and in people like Rajab Bursi and to some extent Haider Amali, we see walaya being transmuted into the point, nukta, right? The nukta, which is the first appearance of God in the cosmos, the point which is analog to the point in writing, the point under the letter Ba, for example. Walaya is like this point which circulates throughout all of the writing. It's because it's in the pen, the ink of the pen. It circulates through here. And Bursi says it circulates there, but it also circulates through the cosmos. And he quoted Ibn Arabi on this precisely. I have another quotation from Ibn Arabi on the idea of walaya, which he uses the synonym life for. We've made every living thing from water. Everything in the universe is alive. Nothing is dead. And this life, this hay, circulates, sarayan, through all wujudat, ceaselessly going around. So walaya is the electricity again of life, or just life as such. Yeah. I should have probably prepared something a little more professional and scholarly on the topic of walaya, since I did have the nerve to use it in my title. But it is, and this, I mean, your question, and thank you very much for encouraging me. There's nothing more important in Shi'ism than walaya. I mean, this is the point again. This is the religion of walaya, what Corban called Shi'ism, the religion of love par excellence, because of this position of walaya. Right? And so it does also mean love. And it is, all prophets are also walis. Not all awliya are prophets. But this walaya is a divine energy, because God himself in the Quran calls himself a wali. He never calls himself a nabi or a rasul, right? Or anything else but he is a protecting friend. An intimate protecting friend, closer to us than our jugular vein. That's walaya. And so this is used in Shi'i thought to make the same points about the imams. Ultimately, Ibn Arabi's work helps Shi'i thought make what might appear to be irrational, helps Shi'i thought make the love of the imams reasonable. reasonable or scientific, if you like, because his vision is so unified. It is an example of Tawheed. Tawheed, of course, does not mean unity, as everyone knows. Tawheed means connected. Tawheed means everything is connected to one thing. If we want to say unity in Arabic, how do we say it? Thank you. Wahda. But we're supposed to be about trying to put Tawheed into practice. And that is connecting everything to the divine source and to everything else. Is that okay?
Should we? Okay, Elisa,
Just
please.
a very small question.
Please.
Wonderful
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You opened your conversation and presentation with this beautiful term when you said God presented himself to us, through us.
Yes.
To us,
Yes,
through us.
That's right.
When we open this, should we think of his spirit, the divine spirit that we have from him, or should we think of God's essence, that creation come? I mean, how do we interpret this? Interpret this through Akbarian, basically. Todd.
A temporary response to your excellent question is I would take a page from Ibn Arabi's book. The more we perfect our prayer, the stronger that our heart will become an iman. And the heart will lead us to the correct thought. Follow the heart. The vision and writings of Ibn Arabi help us understand the obsolescence of such theoretical and conceptual traps as those ultimately quite arbitrary categories, spiritual and material. His engagement and his articulation of the same with consciousness, being, and love demonstrates that it is not anti-intellectual or unscientific to think of the world as love's body, through which love or mercy's energy suffuses and connects all things visible and invisible, known and unknown, knowable and unknowable. He, furthermore, would want us to understand this insight as the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be God's blessing and peace, and the teaching of the Quran, and therefore Islam's great civilizing heritage and gift to the world. A world, he says, that ultimate truth describes to us, through us. فَوَصَّفَ نَفْسَهُ لَنَا بِنَا. Just as earlier he said, فَمَا وَصَفْنَاهُ بِوَصْفَ إِلَّا كُنَّا نَحْنُ ذَلِكَ الْوَصْفِ. Qurban on Suhravardi, God is not, it only reveals himself to us through what is inside us. Man arafa nafsahu also means we can only know God through the self. It is in being leveled that this subjectivity absolves itself. The mountain of the self, as Sheikh Ahmad calls it. The mountain of the self has to be pulverized, made plain, level. It is then fixed in absolute subjectivity by the very act which happens in it and which makes it absolute. Its true self. That's what the ain is, your true self. The dhar and the time of the covenant is your ain, which becomes filled with light. And its capacity can even be changed. And its shape is particular, like a snowflake. Right? Even if it sounds like they all look alike, they don't. And so we change, which we surely must. And as we do, the world that is described through us to us also changes. To think, to do, to be, to love, to know are all prayer for more intensity. Or, if you prefer, abundance of love, knowledge, and life. And the more we are given and the more we take, the more there is. Thank you.
Thank you.